Welcome to this week's explainer from Resilience by Default. Today, we're going to dive into a framework that's, well, it's becoming absolutely essential for any key service provider. We're talking about the supervisory operating cycle. So let's get right into it.
You know, operational resilience gets thrown around a lot, doesn't it? But it isn't just another corporate buzzword. As Terry lays out, this is a fundamental, a core obligation for any critical organization. I mean, what we're really talking about here is the ability to withstand some seriously severe disruption, and ultimately to protect the people and systems that rely on you. It's not optional, it's a regulatory necessity.
Right, so that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? In a world where disruption feels like the new normal, what does good resilience actually look like? How do you go from just talking about it to actually building it in a way you can prove works? Well, that's exactly what this framework is all about. Okay, so here's how we're going to break it all down. We'll start with why this matters so much right now, then we'll look at the framework itself, and then we're going to walk through each of the key areas, from getting your governance right all the way through to responding when things go wrong.
All right, first up, let's just set the scene a bit. The stakes are incredibly high. In today's world, everything is connected, right? So a big disruption, it's not a question of if it's going to happen, but when. And that means having a really structured, top-down approach to resilience isn't just a nice-to-have anymore, it's absolutely essential for survival.
And look, these are the core outcomes we're aiming for. This isn't just about keeping the lights on. We're talking about protecting consumers from what's called intolerable harm, especially vulnerable folks. It's about making sure the market stays stable, proving you can actually survive an extreme scenario, and, at the end of the day, protecting the financial stability of not just your own company, but the entire system. Everything else we'll talk about, it all points back to these goals.
So the big question is, how do we actually get there? How do we achieve those outcomes? Well, that brings us right to the heart of this whole thing, the supervisory operating cycle. Think of it as your framework for action.
And there it is. This is the whole cycle, just as Terry lays it out. You can see it's a continuous loop, right? It's not a straight line. It starts with governance at the top, and then flows through this really logical sequence of identifying what's important, mapping it all out, testing it, and then responding. We're going to break this down piece by piece.
Okay, so where do we start? Well, the framework, quite rightly, begins by looking inwards. You've got to get your own house in order first, right? Before you can even think about managing external risks, you have to get your own foundation solid. And that's exactly what the first two steps are for.
So step one, and this is non-negotiable. It all has to start right at the very top. This is not some IT issue. It's not an operations task to be delegated away. Resilience has to be driven by and accountable to the board. Simple as that. Because without that senior level ownership, honestly, the whole thing is just destined to fail.
And the crucial point here is that this can't just be lip service. This governance has to be real, has to be properly embedded in the business, and needs to be part of your formal risk appetite. And it has to actually influence the big strategic decisions, things like major transformations or mergers and acquisitions. And this is key. It has to be focused on genuine, real-world capability, not just ticking boxes and creating a paper trail for the auditors.
All right, so once you've got that top-level governance sorted, what's next? Well, the next logical step is to figure out what exactly it is you're trying to protect. Step 2 is all about identifying your important business services, your IBS. These are the critical things that, if they went down, would cause really significant harm.
Now, the real mindset shift here is that you have to think externally. You have to look at your business from your customer's point of view. This isn't about what's most profitable for you. It's about what would cause intolerable harm to them, especially to vulnerable customers, or what could genuinely disrupt the entire market. You've got to look at your organization from the outside in.
Okay, so we've identified what's important. The next big phase is figuring out how it all works, and more importantly, at what point it breaks. This is where we get into the nitty-gritty of mapping the entire ecosystem that your services rely on.
It's a cliche, but it's true. No organization is an island. Step 3 is about really accepting that reality and meticulously mapping out every single piece of the puzzle that your important services depend on. That means everything, internal and external.
And this just shows you how complex it can get. We're not just talking about your direct tech suppliers here. You need to map out data flows, key people, and, this is critical, the full chain of third-party and even nth-party providers. We're talking about the suppliers of your suppliers. I mean, just think about that for a second. Some tiny specialist software firm that your critical payment processor relies on, they could be your single point of failure. If they get hit by ransomware, suddenly your customers can't pay.
That's the kind of hidden risk we need to uncover.
Right, so you know what's important, and you know what it all depends on. The next question is, what's the breaking point? Step 4 is all about figuring that out by setting evidence-based impact tolerances for each of those critical services.
And this can't just be a finger-in-the-air guess. It has to be a proper, structured process. You start by looking at your contracts and SLAs, your commitments, and then you have to stress test them. You run what are called severe but plausible scenarios. Think about a major cloud provider going down, a massive power cut, or a really sophisticated cyber attack. You run these tough simulations with your executive teams to find that exact tipping point, the moment where disruption crosses the line into that intolerable harm we mentioned earlier.
Okay, this next section, it is so important in today's world where everything seems to be outsourced. How you manage your critical third parties can literally be the difference between a resilient organization and a vulnerable one.
So, step 5. This is where you have to apply a much deeper, continuous level of scrutiny to the partners your most important services depend on. These are your critical third-party providers, your CTPPs. And let me be clear, the old way of doing a one-off due diligence check when you sign the contract, that just doesn't cut it anymore, not even close.
You've got to look at the whole shebang. How financially stable are they? What's the risk if, say, half the industry relies on them? That's concentration risk. You need to understand their supply chains, those nth parties we talked about. And of course, their cybersecurity maturity. And always remember this, you can outsource the service, but you can never ever outsource the accountability. That always stays with your board.
Which leads us to something that's really challenging, but absolutely vital. You need to have a real, workable plan to get away from a critical provider if the worst happens. In other words, what's your plan B? And is it actually a plan or just a hope?
Yeah, and I think this quote from Terry just hits the nail on the head. Exit arrangements should be operationally credible, not solely contractual. A few lines in a legal document is not a plan. It's just paper. You have to have a properly tested, workable strategy to either switch to another provider or bring that service back in-house. It has to be operationally credible.
Okay, we're now at the final active step in the cycle. This is where the rubber meets the road. All that planning, all that preparation, this is what happens when it meets reality. How do you actually respond when an incident kicks off?
When you're in a crisis, the last thing you want is chaos. You need structure. That means having a clear system for classifying incidents, knowing exactly who to escalate to and when, and having a ready-to-go crisis governance model. And believe me, the regulators are watching this stuff like a hawk. They're not just interested in how you prepared. They want to see timely and transparent communication when things do go wrong.
And that brings us right back around full circle. We're looking at the whole diagram again because it's so important to get this point. This is not a project with a start and an end date. It's a continuous process. Your services will change, your suppliers will change, the threats will evolve, so you have to constantly rinse and repeat. You have to go through the cycle again and again. It has to be adaptive.
So let's leave you with this final thought. Your organization will face disruption. That's a certainty. The only real question is, are you prepared? And following a structured, disciplined cycle like this one is the only way to make sure the answer to that question is a confident yes.
All right, that's it for this week's Explainer. We release these every Tuesday on Spotify and YouTube. If you found this useful, please do like, subscribe, and maybe share it. It really helps us build a channel and figure out what topics are most important to you.